In 2014, Keanu Reeves, seemingly out of nowhere, played a character who would quickly become an action icon, John Wick. Revenge thrillers are far from anything new, but somehow, this one felt fresh. Writer Derek Kolstad laid the foundation by borrowing the Western archetype of a world-weary, retired gunslinger, setting him in a revenge tale centered, possibly for the first time ever, on a puppy. And to support all this, he created a new world filled with mythology and lure, imbuing the movie with a sense of discovery, too. Co-directors Chad Stahelski and Dave Leitch, both of whom came from stunt backgrounds, brought the script to life with action that felt grounded in the way it uses real fighting techniques and accounts for things like reloading your gun. Of course, punching things up a bit to be more visually interesting. Where the action really stands out is in how seamless it is. You're never confused about the geography of a fight scene because it's clear and uninterrupted, without excessive cutting to hide stunt doubles or messy choreography, something helped by Keanu Reeves' dedication to the role. He trained for months to reach a point where often they didn't need to hide a stunt double because there was no double to hide. Reeves, age 49 at the time, was the one behind the fists, guns, and wheels. In stories, we love to see justice served, and we love to see it doled out by an expert. But the secret core to action heroes that really makes us root for them is willpower. And John Wick, as the movie itself tells us, is pure will. He will not stop and will not be stopped, no matter what is required of him, no matter the odds stacked against him, and no matter how many bodies he needs to put in the ground. Is he the biggest, strongest, or fastest in the world? He's probably up there, but there certainly are those who can top him. It's those intangibles which set him apart: focus, commitment, and sheer will. Kolstad realized those were the hidden qualities behind our beloved heroes, so he wrote them into Wick and put them front and center. For one of the most successful action franchises of all time, John Wick begins in an oddly quiet and contemplative place. If it didn't start with the flash forward to John outside the vet clinic, you'd think the movie was a quiet drama about grief. He loses his wife to illness, and at the funeral, Willem Dafoe's character Marcus tells him,
"There's no rhyme or reason to this life. It's days like today scattered among the rest."
Losing a loved one can create a sense that the world is chaos. Horrible things happen for no reason, and if it's disease that robbed you, you don't even get the luxury of justice. There's no one to blame or hold accountable for at least the gratification that scales have somehow been balanced. But revenge stories offer a bit of fantasy fulfillment. In these stories, someone evil wrongs the protagonist, and they get to set things right. The world stops making sense, so they grab it by the throat and beat it into submission. A loved one or loved ones are lost, and they will grieve. But justice served is one major step toward closure, toward peace. This is where John Wick first sets itself apart as something special in the pantheon of revenge stories. He loses his wife to illness. Suddenly, the world has no rhyme or reason. All of John's skills and talents, all his focus, commitment, and will are worthless in the face of that. But Helen knew this would happen, so before her death, she arranged for a puppy named Daisy to be delivered, someone for John to take care of so he doesn't shut down completely. Then Yosef saw John's car. He wanted it, but John wasn't selling. Yosef, the son of a wealthy Russian gangster who happens to be John's old employer, isn't used to hearing no, and he doesn't take it well. So he takes John's car, and he kills Daisy. In the world of film, human lives are a commodity. If you've watched enough, then you've seen countless people die. It's impossible not to become at least a little desensitized, especially when it's a trope, like a loved one being killed as the inciting incident to kick off yet another revenge thriller. Killing a puppy, though, that symbol for innocence, love, and joy, that is something else. That easily reignites our bloodlust. Yosef has to die. Apparently, one of the difficulties Kolstad ran into trying to get this movie made is that directors or studios would suggest you can't just kill the puppy. Yosef should kill his whole family. Of course, missing part of what makes this movie so special. Losing Helen in a way that couldn't be stopped turns John's world upside down more than murder ever could, because at least murder fits into the rules of his reality. People kill each other. You try to stop them, and if you fail, you at least seek revenge. Losing Helen the way he did makes those rules irrelevant, creating an overwhelming need in John to find some way to wrangle control of a world spinning out of control. That creates a powder keg. Killing Daisy, violating the sacred movie convention to leave defenseless animals unharmed, raises our ire and lights that keg. Then Viggo tells us about John Wick, about his willpower, and about how dangerous he is, intercut with John breaking concrete, literally unburying his old life, the one he tried to pave over with some semblance of normalcy. We're mad, we want to see John take control, we learn his reputation as Baba Yaga. Then, he's unleashed. The choreography alone would make the fights an entertaining spectacle, but the story, and Kolstad's unique start to a revenge thriller, make sure we feel them too. I've always believed there are at least two major components to an action sequence. There's the spectacle, how impressive and real does it look, and there's the emotion, how much do we care about the outcome. A sufficient amount of one can make up for the lack of the other, but if you can fire on both cylinders, that's when you get a John Wick. By the way, one valid read of the movie is that John isn't really out for revenge. He just needed an excuse to act, something which lets him use all his skills and talents that couldn't save Helen. Going after Yosef, who has an army protecting him, gives John a large supply of enemies to face. It gives him a feeling of control. Here is a wrong that he can right by killing his way to the gangster's son. Personally, I see it as a complicated mix. Taking Daisy away from John is definitely enough to make him demand retribution, especially since she was Helen's final gift, and a way for John to feel like a part of her is still here. At the same time, John was desperately seeking that sense of control, and this is the perfect excuse. So I think it's a little bit of both. Perhaps Yosef would be on the receiving end of John's wrath either way, but his need for control increased the severity of his retribution and how far he was willing to go. I recently wrote about Scream 6, where the directors followed Wes Craven's lead in taking violence seriously. Victims are mourned, and while the movie is fun, the violence itself isn't. It's interesting to go from that to John Wick, where there's no denying that this movie has plenty of fun with violence. When John breaks open that concrete to reveal his guns, I believe the filmmakers are hoping we'll think, awesome, can't wait to see what John does with those. And he clocks in 77 on-screen kills in the first movie alone. So how does he get away with so much bloodshed without turning into a monster? Part of it is all the legwork in that first act, spending time with his grief, and making sure by the end of it, we're just as angry as him and never lose empathy for his cause. Part of it is that the first big shootout is largely self-defense. A team's been sent to kill John. Part of it is that most of the people he kills are faceless goons we know nothing about. And those who aren't faceless are made pretty unlikable. Props to Alfie Allen. The less obvious trick John Wick uses is slowly ramping up the sensation that what we're watching is not the real world. The first clue is probably after that big shootout when a cop shows up and sees the bodies, but lets John be. That's how big his reputation is. Even the cops know not to interfere with his work. Then John pays in gold to have the bodies removed, our first introduction to this alternative currency in the criminal underworld. Finally, we reach the Continental and fully make the transition into a comic book reality. Of course, there are mobs and assassins in the real world, but, and I guess I can't know this for sure, I don't think they're organized in a secret society overseen by a high table of crime lords, complete with rules, traditions, and formal processes for things like bounties. And this gets taken much further in the sequels, including the revelation that many of the homeless you see are secretly assassins too. Normally, in an action movie, I wouldn't spend much time thinking about how they make the violence palatable, because if you think of the best ones, it's usually obvious. Take Die Hard, for instance. You had an imminent terrorist threat with innocent lives on the line. No one is shedding a tear for Hans Landa. But it's hard to ignore the body count in this movie, with John taking nearly 100 human lives over the loss of a pet. This movie rides a fine line, maintaining enough realism that the action is impressive, but adds enough cinematic flair to be a visual feast and a thrill ride, where it's okay to be entertained by non-stop bloodshed. And the hyper-stylized look doesn't just apply to the action itself, but also the look of the movie overall. When the cop arrives at John's house, his lights turn the walls red behind the silhouette, and many other scenes saturate the screen with reds and blues, like panels you'd see in a comic book. You may be able to read symbolism into the specific colors shown, but I prefer to see it just as a way of visualizing this other world. Watching the story unfold, we know John is re-entrenching himself in the violent world he left behind. But these stylized sequences make that idea visual too, by adding contrast between the stark reality of grief at the beginning and the violent underworld where John can unload his aggression on everyone between him and Yosef. Comparing the look and feel of the scenes, they feel like literally two different realities. And the more time John spends in the underworld reality, the more it sinks its teeth into him. If the John Wick franchise does have anything to say about violence, it's this.
You dip so much as a pinky back into this pond, you may well find something reaches out and drags you back into its depths.
There's no such thing as a one and done. Violence always begets more violence. Yosef kills Daisy, so John kills him and anyone else in his way. Then Yosef's father Vigo kills John's friend Marcus. And finally, John faces off against Vigo himself. In Chapter 2, Santino hears about John's apparent unretirement and comes to collect on a blood oath. He asks John to kill his sister. Then, of course, Santino has to avenge his sister's murder, so he puts a hit out on John. Action franchises often place the hero in a completely new situation with each movie. But in John Wick, the way each chapter unravels from the previous one is another way this franchise sets itself apart. But it also furthers the theme that started in the first one. This world of violence will not let you go. But even in that world, among all the chaos, there is some stability. It seems that honor and loyalty are universally admirable qualities, even in the assassin underworld. Or at least those qualities are admired by enough that violating them has severe consequences, and sticking by them has its rewards. We see both sides. Miss Perkins takes a bigger payday to try and kill John on Continental grounds, a place where assassins aren't allowed to conduct business. And by the end of the movie, she's executed for that sin. There's also Yosef himself, a kid who clearly shows no appreciation for manners or the old guard that came before him. And there's definitely a vibe in the movie that Wick, his friends, and even Vigo come from a time when no one would think to break Continental rules. And everyone would know, you don't mess with the boogeyman. I mean, you don't mess with the guy you send to kill the boogeyman. Part of that is the influence of Westerns on Derek Kolstad's sensibilities. If you listen to his interviews on John Wick, you'll see he mentions them often. On the Script Apart podcast specifically, talking about Yosef, he said this.
A lot of times in movies, it comes down to you have the old weathered gunslinger and the young guy come to town saying, I'm going to put you down. And the reality is what the gunslinger has is experience. And at a certain point, you might wonder if that gunslinger was that young guy who succeeded through attrition to get to where he got.
So yeah, the old guard tends to be wiser and more honorable, because the ones who weren't went the way of Yosef or Miss Perkins. On the other hand, we get the sense that John has always played by the high table's rules and acted with honor. As a result, he has plenty of old friends who go out on a limb to help him. Aurelio the mechanic tells him what he knows about Yosef. Winston tells John where to find him, and of course Marcus is John's guardian angel throughout the movie, getting himself killed to help John. And without that help, John likely wouldn't have survived to see any of the sequels. Sequels where John himself starts to violate some of these sacred rules. But that's a story for another day. So if you enjoyed this video, make sure to let me know that you want to see me cover the rest of the series. And if you don't want this video to end just yet, check out my Patreon for the bonus section, where I give some additional commentary on the movie, behind the scenes tidbits, and other extras. With that, make sure to like, subscribe, hit the bell icon for more, and see you on the next one take.